In this video, I'm going to talk about how Andrew Jackson expanded the power of the presidency as 7th President of the United States. First, I'm going to focus on the Peggy Eaton affair. In the Peggy Eaton affair, we had a situation where the wife of John Eaton, the Secretary of War, was a woman with a bad reputation. And the other members of the cabinet, their wives, including especially, there's Peggy Eaton, both young and old, but the wife of John C. Calhoun was one of he was the vice president, and other members of the cabinet, they all encouraged their husbands not to associate with Peggy Eaton. Now, there was one member of the cabinet who could support Peggy Eaton, and that was Martin Van Buren, and that was because he was single. And Jackson decides to stay and support Peggy Eaton because of certain innuendo and scandal that had followed his own wife right before her death. So he was sympathetic to Peggy Eaton. He sided with her over this issue, and as a result, many of the members of his cabinet resigned, and he ends up relying on two things. First, he relies on Martin Van Buren, the little magician as he was known, and he starts relying on an unofficial group of advisors known as his kitchen cabinet. The reason why this is an expansion of his power is because he's relying on personal advisors and not the Senate-approved cabinet members who had at least some accountability to the Congress. So he's expanding his power with respect to Congress. The next big issue is the nullification issue involving the tariff in South Carolina. This all comes around in 1832. It starts in 28 with the tariff of abominations. In 1832, a new tariff is passed that actually lowers tariff rates, but not enough for South Carolina. So, as a result, South Carolina nullifies the new tariff, refusing to acknowledge it, refusing to collect tariff duties. This puts the president in a predicament. By the way, this is John C. Calhoun. He is the man behind this. He's leading the nullification effort. There's a huge debate over whether or not nullification should be allowed between Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina. Webster is of the opinion that nullification cannot be allowed. Hayne, of course, believes that it should. Webster says that if you allow nullification, the Union is nothing more than a rope of sand. He goes on to say, famously, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Jackson finally takes a position at a toast for Thomas Jefferson's birthday, in which he says, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Calhoun responds by saying, "The union next to our liberty most dear." So there's going to be a showdown here, a showdown between Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun over the issue of nullification. Jackson passes a bill that allows him to use force against South Carolina to compel them to follow the federal law. As a result, however, before this happens, you have a compromise. When the great Henry Clay steps in with the compromise tariff of 1833, offering a reduced tariff rate gradually over 7 years. Eventually, before we go on to this, but eventually the South Carolina rescinds its nullification. The crisis is over, but they do, for good measure, nullify the force bill. Jackson's Native American policy, one of his most controversial actions, especially when you consider the fact that many of the Indians were so-called 5 civilized tribes. We had 5 civilized tribes at the time: the Creek, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, all of them living east of the Mississippi River. Here's some example of how quote-unquote civilized they were, living in fine houses, having an alphabet, having newspapers. They also had a government with a bicameral legislature. So in many ways, not that different from the white Euro-Americans who they were living around. Okay, here's the center of Cherokee Nation living in northern Georgia. This issue really comes about after the discovery of gold in northwest Georgia in Cherokee land. Jackson justifies his removal of the Indians by saying essentially that the Indians need to be removed for their own good, that if the Indians are not moved, they will eventually perish. Okay? And here's some other arguments in favor of keeping or of eliminating the Indians. Indian removal takes place in 1830 with the so-called Indian Removal Act. There are 2 court cases involving the Native Americans. In those cases, especially Worcester versus Georgia, John Marshall rules that the Indians are an independent, domestic dependent nation, but they are therefore not liable to be moved and therefore don't have to follow the laws of Georgia. The response by Jackson is that supposedly, he says, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So he's not going to enforce this decision by the Chief Justice, and this is an example of how the President expands his power with respect to the Supreme Court, because he's not going to enforce their decision. And there's the Trail of Tears into Oklahoma. All the Indians are moved to the west of the Mississippi River. Some of them stay and hide, but most of them are moved. And here's the famous painting of the Trail of Tears. Okay, Jackson uses the veto power more than any other president prior to him. In fact, he vetoes more bills than all the other presidents combined. Famous among them is a veto of the Maysville Road, a road project in Kentucky, the home state of his political rival Henry Clay. He shoots down this internal improvement project. And people start referring to him as King Andrew I because of his expanded power and use of the veto. His most famous veto, however, is a veto of a recharter bill of the First National Bank. Okay, this involves a war between Jackson and Biddle. Jackson does not like the bank. He sees the bank and its president, Biddle, as these monarchical, tyrannical, power-hungry people who serve only the rich and not his constituency, the common man. Jackson does not like the bank for many reasons. Too many foreign investors. Jackson hated paper money. He prefers specie. The bank had too much power over the economy and served only the rich. Biddle had too much power over the economy personally. The bank was anti-democratic because it was not accountable to people. And the bank gave loans to politicians, some of whom were Jackson's enemies. Finally, it was unconstitutional, that old Jeffersonian idea that it wasn't in the Constitution in the first place. Okay. Henry Clay comes up with this idea to get himself elected in the election of 1832 by trying to get the bill rechartered 4 years early. The bank's charter was to expire in 1836. He proposes a bill to have it rechartered in 1832. When Jackson vetoes the recharter bill, Clay can now run for president as a Whig and as a defender of the national bank. And here's Jackson, sorry, it's a bad picture, but Jackson fighting against the hydra of corruption, the national bank. In 1832, in the end, with the bank being the major issue, Jackson wins the election. He defeats Clay, and he takes this now as a mandate to kill the bank. And rather than wait for the charter to expire, he starts trying to kill the bank immediately. Okay. He takes the money out in 1833, takes the money out of the national bank. All federal revenue is taken out and now distributed to state banks known as pet banks. And by 1836, the charter is expired, and by 41, the bank is bankrupt. The Senate officially censures the president, the only president ever to be censured by the Senate, but the damage has been done, at least in terms of congressional power. The president has greatly expanded his power, once again, with the use of the veto here in the bank war. And that's it.